The last defenders of Berlin. On April 16, 1945, two Soviet divisions, composed of Ukrainians and Belarusians, entered the city of Berlin from the north and one from the south. Each division numbered more than 1 million soldiers. They were well armed with tanks and artillery. The German defenders, however, numbered less than 150,000 soldiers. These were soldiers from the remnants of Wehrmacht brigades, the Waffen-SS and the Hitler Youth, members of the Volkssturm. The Germans had only about 200 to 300 tanks and assault guns in Berlin, which was very few considering the scale of the fighting and the number of enemy forces. The Red Army had many more tanks at its disposal. About 6,000 armored vehicles participated in the Berlin operation. The Soviet forces were therefore not only numerically superior, but also technologically and logistically. The German armored units in Berlin were made up of the remnants of various units, including the remaining tanks from elite units such as the Panther and Tiger. One of the symbolic locations of the last days of the Battle of Berlin was the Zoo area, which became an important strategic point due to its underground bunkers and crossroads. Among the defenders of this area were many young boys, only 14 or 15 years old, members of the Hitler Youth. These young men were armed with bazookas, Panzerfaust, and hand grenades, and their courage often bordered on fanaticism. As the Red Army advanced towards the center of Berlin, these young fighters pursued Soviet tanks from ambushes and destroyed them with Panzerfausts, often in very risky maneuvers. One account of Soviet soldiers describes a scene where young boys from the Hitler Youth climbed onto their tanks and threw grenades at them, even though they knew they would be killed. One of these young defenders, 15-year-old Alfred Czech, later testified how at that moment he felt he was fighting for his homeland, even though he already knew the war was lost. He was one of the few who survived after being captured by Soviet soldiers and spared because of his youth. Another famous story concerns the defenders of the Moltke Bridge, who tried to prevent the Red Army from crossing the Spree River and advancing towards the Reichstag. The defenders consisted of the Volkssturm, the remaining SS units and a few tanks. Despite the lack of ammunition and the complete superiority of the Soviet forces, they fought to the last. They also tried to blow up the bridge, but failed. When the Soviet army finally crossed the bridge, most of the defenders were either killed in battle or captured. The surviving SS members often committed suicide rather than surrender. These stories illustrate the lengths some Germans were willing to go to defend the city, even though the outcome of the battle was already decided. Propaganda and fear of Soviet retaliation led people to believe that it was their duty to fight to the last. However, many historians emphasize that these young and old soldiers were primarily victims of a hopeless situation in which their leaders had left them at the mercy of the enemy. The Reichstag, a symbol of German power and Nazi propaganda, became the scene of one of the most infamous battles of the last days of the war. The defenders were mostly members of the SS and Volkssturm, who clung to the building as a last symbol of resistance. Soviet soldiers fought for every floor, room, and corridor. After a brutal battle, Soviet soldier Mikhail Igorov raised the red flag atop the Reichstag on April 30, 1945, becoming one of the most recognizable symbols of the Soviet victory. During the final days of Berlin's defense, some defenders and civilians attempted to escape the besieged city. Some managed to break through the Soviet encirclement and flee west, where they attempted to surrender to the Allied forces. One such story is of a group of German soldiers who crossed the Havel River at night and broke through Soviet lines, many losing their lives. Those who survived encountered American forces and surrendered, hoping for better treatment. When Berlin officially capitulated on May 2, 1945, the city was in ruins. More than 100,000 German soldiers and civilians died, while the Red Army lost approximately 80,000 soldiers. Those who survived witnessed the end of the Third Reich, which left Europe in complete chaos. The stories of the defenders of Berlin are now a symbol of the ruthlessness of war, the hopelessness of despair, and the absurdity of fanaticism that still claims so many lives in the final days of the war. The Battle of Berlin ended on May 2, 1945, when the city officially surrendered. By then, the city was in ruins, and many civilians and defenders had lost their lives in the despair that marked the end of the Third Reich. Anyway, that was the day the Third Reich and Hitler's dream of a great Germany came to an end.